Hi, Mike Gibson coming to you live from SCAI 2018 here in San Diego, and I'm joined again by Arnold Seto and Dean Boudoulas. Guys, there are some new consensus statements regarding length of stay after PCI. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, just released this week on early release on the Catheterization and Cardiovascular Interventions website. We've just updated the consensus recommendations for length of stay after PCI. As you may know, the SCAI is the only organization who have put out recommendations on length of stay after PCI. So there's a lot of potential impact on this in terms of practice. And these guidelines haven't been updated since 2009, and there's a lot of disagreement with some of them. Up to 50% of the operators weren't really aware of the guidelines, and only about 33% of the time did they actually agree with them.
Really?
The guidelines had really started to become out of date with clinical practice.
Right.
20% of patients being discharged currently on the same day, elective outpatients. The guidelines that were originally drawn up to defend patient safety ended up being potentially a liability for the society and operators, because it would tend to restrict people who are age over 70, age over 80 from even consideration for same-day discharge. Similarly, there are anatomical constraints of a single stent less than 28 millimeters or proximal LID that would exclude patients from PCI, same-day discharge after PCI. And part of the goal of this guidance document was to say, a lot of these restrictions, they weren't necessarily evidence-based, and they were and not consistent with current practice. And so this new guideline, this new consensus update, we think will help alleviate some of these concerns and allow to support the best judgment of our operators.
I like to say my mother can be at the dentist office longer than a PCI with same-day discharge now, you know?
That's right.
Dean, who are the people who would benefit from a longer stay? Our default mode seems to be same-day discharge. Who's the person who's not a good candidate for that?
You really, almost everyone's a candidate. It really comes down to clinical judgment, and I think the key is, just like in anything in medicine, that you really need to individualize for that particular patient. So if a complication arises during the procedure, obviously it's concern for further observation. Also, to think about even post-procedure, you need to also have a safety network at home with a reasonable adult that can take the patient home, monitor the patient, and so forth. It's not just intra-procedure issues, it's also the post-procedure care. Correct.
Yeah. Well, it sounds philosophically like these guidelines are not proscriptive but allow for judgment. Is that generally what you're trying to do?
That's exactly the word we're using. The prior document was trying to be a little bit prescriptive and saying these are patients we're concerned about that shouldn't be discharged the same day. Now, as evidence has developed over the last 10 years, we've shown that many of these patients can be safely discharged as long as they've met their clinical milestones, and that's our new model.
Right.
Where patients have met their clinical milestones in terms of patient stability, procedural success, and programmatic requirements. And if they meet these milestones, meaning they've had a successful procedure without complications, that their comorbidities are stable, and that they have met the programmatic requirements, they receive the dual antiplatelet therapy, they have a safe place to go home to discharge to watch them, they've received their follow-up appointments, then these are the criteria that they need to make. And the benefit of this is that this model can be applied not just to elective PCIs, but also non-elective PCIs like ACS patients. How long should they stay afterwards? Well, many people would have thought that they need to stay for up to 5 days after an acute MI, but when people have met these milestones, then potentially they could be discharged. And again, we're not saying that they must be discharged. One of our critical points is that if a patient doesn't feel comfortable being discharged, or if the doctor doesn't feel comfortable discharging his patient, they by no means should be forced to, but at least the document will allow for this possibility that if you do feel like someone's stable for discharge and the patient is comfortable doing so, that is certainly within the realm of reasonable clinical care.
Well, guys, I know how hard it is to get interventional cardiologists to agree on anything, and thanks for putting all this together. I know how much work it is, and thanks for joining us here today, and thanks to all of you for joining us here live from SCAI 2018.